What would you do if someone judged you the moment you walked through the door? When an elderly black man was told to leave a high-end store unless he was buying something, his calm response left everyone stunned. What happened next? He didn't just buy something, he bought everything. Stay tuned as we uncover the powerful story of courage, dignity, and a life-changing lesson that left an entire community in awe. Tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will leave you speechless. The rain tapped softly on the glass as Elijah Carter stepped into the store. He paused just inside the door, taking in the bright lights and polished floors. The shelves were lined with expensive clothes, bags, and shoes, all arranged neatly like a picture in a magazine. The air smelled faintly of cedar wood, mixed with something artificial, like a store trying to feel fancier than it was. A young woman behind the front counter looked up and noticed him. She gave him a quick smile, but it didn't seem real. She glanced away nervously and adjusted her name tag. "Good evening," she said, her voice quiet. Elijah gave her a small nod and walked further into the store. At the back of the store, Trent Miller leaned against the counter, arms folded across his chest. He was the manager, early 40s, clean-cut, with the kind of smug expression that came from thinking he had everything under control. His sharp eyes followed Elijah as he walked past the racks, hands calmly at his sides. Trent muttered to the young woman without looking at her. "Keep an eye on him," he said under his breath, "just in case." She glanced at him, unsure, but didn't say anything. Elijah stopped at a display near the center of the store. He studied a leather bag for a long moment, running his fingers lightly over the strap. Trent's voice broke the silence. "Excuse me, sir," he called out, his tone fake-friendly. "Can I help you with something?" Elijah looked up, his face calm. "No, thank you. Just browsing." Trent's smile tightened. He stepped out from behind the counter and approached, his shoes clicking sharply on the floor. "Well," he said, his voice loud enough for others to hear, "if you're not planning to buy anything, I'm afraid we'll have to ask you to leave." The store grew quiet. A few other customers glanced over but quickly looked away, pretending not to notice. Elijah stood straighter, his hand resting lightly on the display. His eyes met Trent's without flinching. "What makes you think I'm not planning to buy something?" he asked, his voice steady. Trent's smirk widened, as if he thought he had the upper hand. "No offense, sir," he said, dripping with insincerity, "but this store isn't exactly for everyone." For a moment, Elijah said nothing. Then he tilted his head slightly and spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You're right. This store isn't for everyone, but today it's for me." Trent crossed his arms, laughing under his breath. "Oh, is that so? And what exactly are you planning to buy?" Elijah looked him in the eye. "Everything." Trent stared at Elijah, his smirk frozen in place, unsure if the old man was joking or simply out of his depth. A faint laugh escaped his lips, but it was awkward now, less confident. "Everything?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow. The word seemed absurd, like a child boasting about buying the moon. Elijah nodded once, his expression calm. "Everything," he said again, his voice steady, unshaken by the mounting tension in the room. Rachel, the young employee, stood a few steps away, watching the scene unfold. Her hands fidgeted at her sides, and her eyes darted between Trent and Elijah. She wanted to speak up, to say something to break the silence, but the weight of Trent's authority kept her rooted in place. Trent chuckled and glanced at a nearby customer, as if seeking some silent confirmation that this situation was as ridiculous as it seemed. "All right," he said finally, his voice louder now, almost performative. "Let's see it then. If you're planning to buy everything, you'll need to prove you can pay for it." Elijah reached into his coat pocket, moving slowly and deliberately, as if savoring the moment. The room seemed to hold its breath. For a fleeting second, Trent's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing as he watched the older man. When Elijah pulled out a sleek black phone, Trent relaxed slightly, his shoulders dropping back into a posture of smug control. "You're not serious," Trent said with a forced laugh. "You're not calling someone, are you?" Elijah didn't answer right away. Instead, he swiped through his phone with a practiced ease. "Do you know what I've learned in my years, young man?" he asked calmly, without looking up. Trent crossed his arms, his patience wearing thin. "I don't know, sir. What have you learned?" Elijah finally looked up, his gaze sharp and steady. "That you don't have to shout to be heard. Actions speak louder." With that, he pressed a button on his phone and lifted it to his ear. The room was silent except for the faint rain outside and the distant hum of music playing in the background. Trent's confidence began to waver. "Who are you calling?" he asked, his voice quieter now, tinged with unease. Elijah didn't answer right away. Instead, he smiled faintly, as if he found the question amusing. "Someone who knows a good investment when they see one," he replied cryptically before turning his attention back to the call. Rachel took a hesitant step forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we should give him a moment, Trent," she said, her words shaky but sincere. "He's not hurting anyone." Trent shot her a sharp look. "Stay out of this," he snapped. "It's under control." But as Elijah continued to speak softly into the phone, the balance of power in the room shifted. Customers lingered a little longer than they should have, their eyes darting curiously toward the unfolding drama. Rachel's unease grew, and even Trent's once cocky demeanor started to crack as he glanced back at Elijah, who now looked more composed than ever. When Elijah finally ended the call, he slid his phone back into his pocket and met Trent's gaze. "You should prepare the inventory," he said simply, his tone carrying a weight that didn't need to be explained. Trent opened his mouth to argue, but something in Elijah's expression stopped him. The older man's calm was unshakable, like the quiet before a storm. Trent's confidence wavered, but his pride refused to let him back down. He puffed out his chest and forced a laugh. "Fine," he said. "If you're so serious, then let's get started." Elijah nodded. "Good, I've got plenty of time." Then, with a calmness that rattled the room, he stepped past Trent and moved toward the counter, leaving the manager standing there, unsure of what to do next. Trent stood frozen for a moment, watching Elijah walk toward the counter with the kind of unhurried confidence that made every step feel heavier than it should. The older man's composure, so steady and deliberate, felt unnerving now. Trent cleared his throat, trying to regain some control over the situation. "Rachel," he barked, turning sharply toward her. "Go get the inventory list. If this man's serious, we'll need it." Rachel hesitated, glancing at Elijah, then back at Trent. "Are you sure?" "Now," Trent snapped, cutting her off. His tone left no room for argument. She swallowed her words and hurried toward the back room, leaving an awkward silence behind her. Elijah reached the counter and placed his hands on the edge, leaning slightly. He glanced around, taking in the luxurious displays and the carefully arranged items with a faint, thoughtful smile. "Nice place you've got here," he said casually, his voice calm and conversational. "How long have you been running it?" Trent bristled at the question, unsure if it was genuine or some kind of subtle jab. 3 years, he replied curtly, standing stiffly across from Elijah. "We cater to a very specific clientele." "I can see that," Elijah replied with a small nod, his eyes scanning the room. "Everything here looks very well maintained." There was no sarcasm in his tone, but the words seemed to carry a deeper meaning, one that made Trent shift uncomfortably. Before Trent could respond, Rachel returned with a tablet in her hands, holding it out awkwardly. "Here's the inventory list," she said softly, avoiding eye contact with either of them. Trent snatched the tablet and skimmed the screen, muttering to himself as he scrolled through the extensive catalog. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "There's no way he's serious." Elijah remained silent, his expression unchanging. He didn't need to respond to Trent's doubts. Instead, he gestured toward the tablet. "Let's start with the backstock," he said simply. "Whatever's in the storage room, we'll work our way up." Trent's jaw tightened, but he forced a tight-lipped smile. "Fine," he said, his tone sharp. "If you want to waste your time, be my guest." He turned to Rachel, shoving the tablet toward her. "Take him to the back," he ordered. "Show him what we've got." Rachel hesitated, glancing at Elijah as if silently apologizing for Trent's behavior. Elijah gave her a small, reassuring nod, as if to say he understood. She sighed quietly and gestured toward the door behind the counter. "This way," she said. Elijah followed her, his steps steady and unhurried. As they walked, Rachel spoke quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry about him," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "He's not usually this. Well, maybe he is, but I'm sorry." Elijah chuckled softly. "You've got nothing to apologize for," he said gently. "You're just doing your job." Rachel looked down, her cheeks flushing slightly. Still, it's not right. They reached the storage room, a dimly lit space filled with boxes stacked neatly against the walls. Rachel flipped on the light, revealing rows of high-end products still wrapped in pristine packaging. "This is everything we have in the back," she said, gesturing to the neatly organized shelves. Elijah walked slowly through the room, his eyes scanning the shelves with quiet interest. He stopped in front of a stack of boxes labeled with designer names and ran his hand lightly across the surface. "You've got quite the collection here," he said, his voice thoughtful. Rachel nodded, unsure of what to say. She watched as Elijah moved through the room, his calm presence filling the space in a way that felt almost heavy. Finally, he turned back to her and smiled. "Let's make it simple," he said. "I'll take it all." Her eyes widened slightly. "All of it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "All of it," Elijah repeated, his tone unwavering. "You might want to start making some calls. I'll need a way to get it all out of here." Rachel hesitated, torn between following Trent's orders and the growing sense that Elijah was about to do something far bigger than she could understand. She nodded slowly and pulled out her phone. "Okay," she said quietly. I'll get started." As she stepped away to make the call, Elijah stood in the center of the storage room, his hands in his pockets, surveying the space with a faint, knowing smile. There was no rush, no urgency in his demeanor. He had all the time in the world, and he knew that the real weight of his actions hadn't even begun to sink in yet. Back in the main showroom, Trent paced behind the counter, tapping his fingers against the surface in irritation. His smug confidence had given way to restless annoyance. He glanced toward the door leading to the back, muttering under his breath. "This is a waste of time. Who does he think he's fooling?" The other customers had mostly left, sensing the tension in the air, leaving the store feeling empty and oddly quiet. Trent's irritation only grew as the stillness pressed on him. He hated not being in control, and this old man's calm demeanor was starting to get under his skin. He considered heading to the back himself, but something held him in place. Perhaps a small, nagging fear that Elijah was more serious than he wanted to believe. The silence was broken when Rachel returned from the storage room. She held her phone tightly in one hand, her expression conflicted as she approached Trent. "I called the delivery service," she said hesitantly. "They're sending a truck." Trent stared at her as though she'd just spoken another language. "You what?" he snapped. "Why would you do that? You really think he's going to pay for any of this?" Rachel swallowed, her grip tightening on her phone. "He asked me to," she said quietly. "And I think he means it, Trent." Trent scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "He's bluffing, he's wasting our time. Watch. He'll bail the second we ask for payment." But even as he said the words, there was an edge of doubt in his voice, and his pacing grew more restless. A moment later, Elijah emerged from the back room, walking with the same unhurried stride. He stopped at the counter and placed his hands on the edge, meeting Trent's gaze with the same calm, steady look that had unnerved him from the start. "I've made my decision," Elijah said simply. "I'll take everything in the back and everything on the floor." Trent forced a laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, really? And how exactly are you planning to pay for all of this, huh?" He leaned forward slightly, as if daring Elijah to come up with an answer. Elijah didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket once more, pulling out a sleek leather wallet. From it, he produced a black card, sleek, simple, and unmistakable. The moment it hit the counter, Trent's smirk evaporated. Rachel's eyes widened slightly as she recognized the unmistakable sheen of an exclusive credit card, one reserved for people with near-limitless financial means. Even Trent, who prided himself on keeping his composure, couldn't hide the shock that flickered across his face. His mouth opened and closed for a moment, no words coming out. "Is that enough proof for you?" Elijah asked, his voice calm but with a subtle edge that made Trent's face flush. Trent quickly recovered, clearing his throat and grabbing the card off the counter, his hands slightly shaky. "Right," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. Let me run this." As Trent disappeared behind the counter to process the payment, Rachel stepped closer to Elijah, her voice barely above a whisper. "You really meant it," she said, her tone a mix of amazement and confusion. "You're actually buying everything." Elijah glanced at her, his expression softening. "I've been meaning to do something like this for a while," he said simply. "Sometimes you just need the right moment." Rachel tilted her head, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Why here? Why now?" Elijah's gaze shifted slightly, as if looking at something far away. "You could say this place reminds me of somewhere I've been before," he said, "and someone who taught me to stand my ground." Before Rachel could respond, Trent returned, his face pale but composed. "It went through," he said stiffly, setting the card back on the counter. "The purchase is confirmed." The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel's eyes flickered between Trent and Elijah, the gravity of the moment slowly sinking in. Elijah gave Trent a faint smile, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was the quiet, measured smile of a man who had already won long before this moment. "Well," Elijah said, straightening his coat. "Looks like we've got some work to do. The truck will be here soon, right?" Rachel nodded quickly, still trying to process everything. Yes. It'll be here in about 20 minutes. "Good," Elijah said with a nod. "Now let's start packing things up. We've got a lot of people to help." His words hung in the air, and for the first time Trent looked genuinely unsure of what to say. The silence in the store was thick as everyone tried to process what had just happened. Trent stood behind the counter, gripping the edge tightly, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the image of the black card, sleek, pristine, and unmistakable. It wasn't just the amount of money involved, it was the sheer confidence Elijah exuded, the way he dismantled Trent's assumptions without raising his voice. It made Trent feel small, a sensation he didn't experience often, and he hated it. Elijah, however, was calm as ever. He turned to Rachel, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had filled the room from the start. "Let's make this easy," he said. "We'll start with the items in the back. Bring out the boxes and get them ready for loading." Rachel nodded quickly, still wide-eyed but eager to follow his instructions. She disappeared into the storage room without a word. Elijah shifted his gaze back to Trent, who had yet to move. "You'll need to call your delivery service," Elijah said evenly. "What I've arranged won't be enough for everything here. We'll need a second truck." Trent's jaw tightened, but the edge of defiance in his demeanor was dulled. "A second truck?" he repeated, his tone flat. "You can't be serious, you're buying out the entire store." Elijah tilted his head slightly, his expression unwavering. "That's exactly what I'm doing. So I'll need you to make the call, or should I?" The question landed like a sharp jab, and Trent bristled, his pride momentarily reigniting. "Fine," he snapped, grabbing his phone off the counter. "But don't expect me to handle the logistics for this circus." As Trent begrudgingly made the call, Elijah turned and wandered through the store, his hands in his pockets. His movements were unhurried, his gaze thoughtful as he walked past the rows of expensive displays. He paused by a shelf lined with designer scarves and ran his fingers lightly over the soft fabric of one. A faint smile touched his lips, though there was a wistfulness in his eyes. For a brief moment, the hum of the store faded, replaced by a memory. He saw himself years ago standing in a small shop much like this one, though it wasn't nearly as polished or grand. His wife Clara had stood beside him, her eyes lighting up as she held up a simple silk scarf. "One day, Eli," she'd said, her voice warm with hope. "One day, we'll walk into a place like this and they won't look at us like we don't belong." Her words echoed in his mind, bittersweet and full of meaning. She'd believed in him, always. Even when the world made it clear they weren't welcome in certain spaces, she'd reminded him to dream bigger, to push further. And now, here he was, standing in the very kind of store she'd spoken of, making good on a promise he hadn't even realized he was keeping. "Sir?" Rachel's voice broke through the memory, pulling him back to the present. She was standing near the counter, her arms full of folded items. "We've started bringing everything out. The truck should be here soon." Elijah nodded, his smile softening. "Good. Thank you." As Rachel moved to continue her work, Trent slammed his phone onto the counter with more force than necessary, cutting through the calm. "Second truck's on its way," he muttered, his voice tight with frustration. "Happy now?" Elijah turned to face him, his expression as steady as ever. "I'm not looking for your happiness," he said simply. "I'm looking to make sure this gets done right." Trent opened his mouth to fire back a response, but the sound of the front door opening stopped him. A delivery driver stepped in, shaking rain off his jacket, and glanced around the store. "Someone called for a pickup?" he asked. Elijah stepped forward. "That would be me," he said with a polite nod. "There's more to come, but we can start loading what's ready." The driver blinked, a little taken aback by the request, but nodded. "All right then," he said. "Let's get to it." Rachel quickly moved to help the driver, while Elijah stayed near the counter, watching the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. Trent lingered behind the counter, his irritation simmering just below the surface as he watched the store. He managed being methodically emptied piece by piece. "What's the point of all this?" Trent finally asked, unable to hold back any longer. His tone was sharp, but there was a flicker of genuine curiosity beneath it. "You've made your statement. You proved your point. Why go this far?" Elijah turned to him, his gaze steady. "You think this is about proving something to you?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't about you, this is about something bigger." Trent frowned, clearly not understanding. "Bigger than what? You buying out the store just to... what? Take the high road?" Elijah held his gaze, unflinching. "You'll see soon enough." With that, he turned back to the scene in front of him, leaving Trent standing there, unsettled and more confused than ever. The rain outside had slowed to a soft drizzle, the sound blending with the faint rustling of bags and boxes being moved from the store to the waiting truck. Rachel worked alongside the delivery driver, carefully stacking items and organizing them for transport. Her movements were quick but cautious, as if she didn't want to damage anything. Every so often she glanced over at Elijah, who stood near the counter, quietly overseeing the process. His calm presence, even in the chaos, made her feel oddly reassured. Trent, meanwhile, leaned against the counter with his arms crossed, his jaw tight as he watched the store empty out piece by piece. The racks were thinning, the pristine displays now disrupted. He couldn't decide if he was more irritated by the logistical headache Elijah had caused, or by the fact that he still didn't understand why. "You're really not going to tell me what this is all about?" Trent finally asked, breaking the silence. Elijah turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting Trent's. "What do you think it's about?" he asked, his tone measured, as if challenging Trent to think deeper. Trent scoffed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. Making some kind of point? Teaching me a lesson?" His voice was laced with sarcasm, but there was an edge of vulnerability beneath it, an unspoken acknowledgement that he might be missing something important. Elijah studied him for a moment, then let out a soft chuckle. "You think too small," he said simply, turning back to watch the loading process. Rachel, overhearing the exchange, hesitated for a moment before stepping closer to the counter. "I don't think it's about the store," she said softly, her voice tentative but thoughtful. "I think it's about the people." Trent shot her a skeptical look. What people? Rachel glanced at Elijah, who gave her a small nod, encouraging her to continue. She took a breath and turned back to Trent. The people this is going to help, the ones who need it more than the ones who shop here. Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, Trent didn't have an immediate response. He frowned, his mind working, but he didn't push back. Just then, the delivery driver approached Elijah, wiping his hands on his jeans. First truck's almost full, he said. Where's all this going, anyway? Elijah smiled faintly. A few places, he said. Community centers, shelters, schools. Anywhere it can make a difference. The driver raised his eyebrows, clearly impressed. That's a lot of stuff, he said. You sure about this? Quite sure, Elijah replied. I've been sure for a long time. The driver nodded and headed back outside, leaving the room quiet again. Rachel looked at Elijah, her curiosity bubbling over. Why now? She asked softly. Why do all of this today? Elijah turned to her, his gaze warm but steady. Sometimes, the moment chooses you, he said, and when it does, you have to be ready. Rachel blinked, unsure how to respond, but his words seemed to linger in the air, heavy with meaning. She glanced at Trent, who stood silently, looking more uncertain than ever. Elijah walked to the window, his hands in his pockets, and stared out at the street. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving the pavement slick and glistening under the dim streetlights. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought, his expression distant. When I was younger, he began, his voice low but clear, there were places I couldn't walk into without someone watching me like I didn't belong. Places like this. He gestured around the store, his hand moving slowly. But it wasn't just the stores. It was schools, jobs, neighborhoods. The world itself felt like it wasn't made for people like me. Rachel's eyes widened slightly, and even Trent looked up, drawn in despite himself. Elijah turned back to face them, his gaze steady. I'm not buying this store because I need what's in it, he continued. I'm buying it because I want to remind people that they belong, that they deserve better. And sometimes, to make that point, you have to take up space where they don't expect you to. Rachel nodded slowly, her chest tightening as she realized the depth of his actions. Trent, for the first time, had no sarcasm to offer. He simply stared at Elijah, the weight of his words sinking in. Now, Elijah said, his tone lighter, breaking the heavy silence. Let's finish getting everything packed. We've got more work to do. Without waiting for a response, he turned back to the counter and picked up a small scarf from the display. A soft, deep red piece that seemed to catch his eye. He held it for a moment, running his fingers over the fabric before adding it to the growing pile of items ready to be loaded. Rachel, emboldened by his presence, returned to her work with renewed focus. Even Trent, though reluctant, didn't say another word as the store continued to empty out. Something had shifted, though none of them could quite name what it was. The hum of activity grew louder as the first truck reached full capacity. Boxes lined the walls, shelves stood nearly bare, and the floor of the once luxurious boutique was beginning to look more like the aftermath of a moving sale than a high-end store. Rachel worked alongside the delivery driver, carefully organizing the remaining items to ensure they would fit into the second truck. Though her body ached from the constant lifting and packing, her heart felt light, filled with a strange mix of purpose and wonder. Trent lingered by the counter, quieter now, his usual arrogance dulled into a simmering frustration. He watched Elijah from a distance, studying the man's every movement as if trying to make sense of him. There was something about Elijah's calm demeanor that gnawed at him, a confidence that wasn't loud or boastful, but deeply rooted, unshakable. Trent couldn't decide whether it irritated him or made him feel smaller somehow. Elijah moved toward the front window, his hands clasped behind his back, surveying the emptying store. The rain had stopped completely, and the street outside gleamed under the amber glow of streetlights. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, the soft lines on his face etched by years of hard-won experience. He saw not just himself, but the echoes of a younger man, a man who had stood outside places like this and dared to dream of walking through the doors without hesitation. Rachel, noticing him pause by the window, approached tentatively, her hands wiping dust from her uniform. "Mr. Carter?" she said softly. Elijah turned to her, his expression warm. "Yes? I was wondering," she began, hesitating slightly. "Have you ever done something like this before?" Elijah smiled faintly, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of humor and reflection. "Not exactly," he admitted, "though I've spent most of my life trying to help in smaller ways. Scholarships here, donations there. Quiet things." He glanced back at the nearly empty store. "This is a bit louder, I suppose." Rachel smiled despite herself. "It's incredible," she said, her voice sincere. "I don't think I've ever seen anything like this." Elijah's smile deepened, but there was a sadness beneath it. Sometimes it takes something loud to get people to notice what's been quiet for too long. Rachel tilted her head, her curiosity growing. "What do you mean?" Elijah gestured toward the shelves. "Places like this. They look beautiful on the outside, polished, perfect, but they're part of something bigger. A world that decides who belongs and who doesn't. A world that tells people like me we're out of place the moment we walk through the door." Rachel's chest tightened. She thought back to all the times she'd seen Trent or other managers subtly steer certain customers out of the store. She'd never spoken up, telling herself it wasn't her place. But now the memory of those moments made her stomach twist uncomfortably. "I've walked into rooms where every glance told me I didn't belong," Elijah continued, his voice steady but weighted. "I've been followed through stores, ignored at counters, passed over for opportunities I'd earned. It wears on you after a while. Makes you wonder if the world will ever see you as more than the color of your skin." Rachel's throat tightened, but she found herself nodding slowly. I think I've seen that happen before," she admitted. "I just didn't know what to do." Elijah looked at her with quiet understanding. "It's never too late to decide what to do," he said gently. "Every small choice adds up. Every voice matters." Rachel swallowed hard, her mind racing with memories of all the times she'd felt powerless, or worse, complicit. She looked down at her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think I've been as brave as you." Elijah chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Bravery doesn't always feel big," he said. "Sometimes it's as small as speaking up when it's easier to stay quiet, or taking the first step when you don't know where it'll lead." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the second truck pulling up outside. The driver honked twice, breaking the stillness of the moment. Elijah turned toward the sound, nodding approvingly. "Right on time." Rachel stepped aside as the new driver entered, shaking off the chill from outside. He glanced around the store, clearly surprised at how much had already been packed and cleared. "This everything?" he asked, his tone casual. Elijah stepped forward, extending a hand. "Not quite. There's still more to load," he said, shaking the driver's hand firmly. "But I appreciate you getting here so quickly." "No problem," the driver replied. "Where's it all going?" Elijah gestured toward Rachel. "She has the addresses, food banks, schools, shelters, anywhere people can use what's been sitting here gathering dust." The driver nodded, clearly impressed. "All right then, let's get to it." As the driver began coordinating with his partner, Elijah turned back to Rachel. "Help them with the addresses," he said. "Make sure everything goes where it needs to." Rachel nodded quickly, eager to be part of something bigger than herself. She moved toward the drivers, her voice steady now as she gave them the details. Elijah stayed by the window, watching the activity unfold. He could feel Trent's gaze on him, sharp and probing. Finally, Trent spoke, his voice quieter than before. "Why do you care so much?" Trent asked, almost grudgingly. "You're just one guy. You can't change the whole world." Elijah turned slowly, his gaze steady. "Maybe not the whole world," he said. "But someone's world, that's enough for me." Trent fell silent, the words landing heavier than he expected. For the first time, he didn't have a sarcastic retort or a dismissive remark. He simply stood there, watching as the store he'd once controlled was emptied out for a purpose he was only beginning to understand. The trucks outside hummed as the last of the items were loaded, their engines ready to carry the goods to a new destination. Elijah remained calm, a quiet sense of satisfaction radiating from him as the pieces of his plan came together. He wasn't trying to change everything, just enough to make a difference, and that, for now, was more than enough. The second truck rumbled softly outside, its engine vibrating against the quiet street as the last few items were carefully loaded. Inside the store, the once bustling shelves now stood almost completely empty, their polished surfaces exposed and barren. The boutique, once a symbol of exclusivity and opulence, felt hollow now, like a stage after the curtain had dropped. She looked at Elijah, her voice barely a whisper. You're turning it into something better." "That's the idea," Elijah said with a small nod. "It's not just about buying things. It's about changing the story." Trent opened his mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. For once he had nothing to say. Elijah's quiet conviction had left him speechless. Outside, the trucks roared to life, their engines ready to carry the goods to the community. Elijah glanced toward the sound, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. "The work isn't done," he said softly, "but it's a start." And with that, he turned toward the door, his presence still commanding yet humble, leaving Trent and Rachel to stand in the empty store, forever changed. Elijah stepped out into the cool night air, his breath visible in the damp chill left behind by the rain. The streetlights flickered faintly, casting long shadows onto the wet pavement. Behind him, the second truck roared to life, its headlights cutting through the fog as it began to pull away. Elijah stood still for a moment, watching it disappear down the street, his hands resting in his coat pockets. Rachel emerged a moment later, her footsteps quick and purposeful as she caught up to him. "Mr. Carter," she called softly, her voice carrying a mix of urgency and admiration. "Wait." Elijah turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. "Yes?" he asked, his tone as calm as ever. She hesitated, suddenly unsure of what she wanted to say. Her hands fidgeted at her sides, her thoughts swirling. I wanted to thank you," she said finally, "for everything. Not just what you're doing for the people out there, but for what you've shown me." Elijah tilted his head slightly, his expression curious. "And what's that?" Rachel took a deep breath, her words tumbling out in a rush. "That I don't have to stay silent when something feels wrong, that I can make a difference, even in small ways." Her cheeks flushed as she added, "I think I've been too afraid to speak up for a long time, and seeing you do all of this, it's made me realize I don't want to stay afraid." Elijah's face softened, a warm smile spreading across his features. "Fear has a way of keeping us small," he said gently. "But once you step past it, you'll find there's a lot more you can do than you ever thought possible." Rachel nodded, her chest tightening with emotion. "I want to be better," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor beneath it. "I want to stand up for the right things like you." "You've already started," Elijah said. "Recognizing what needs to change is the first step. The rest is just following through." She smiled, her shoulders relaxing as his words sank in. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was moving towards something meaningful. The sound of footsteps drew their attention back toward the store. Trent had stepped outside, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his expression guarded. He stood a few feet away, shifting awkwardly as if he didn't know how to approach. Elijah gave him a steady look, waiting for him to speak. Trent hesitated, his gaze darting between Elijah and Rachel before finally settling on Elijah. "I don't get it," Trent said, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier bravado. "Why go this far? You've already made your point. Why buy the store? Why any of it?" Elijah studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally he said, "What you see is going too far. I see as long overdue. Trent frowned, but Elijah continued before he could respond. This isn't just about proving a point. It's about building something better. For years, stores like this have thrived on the idea that some people belong and others don't. I'm changing that. This store will be a place where everyone feels welcome. No more assumptions. No more judgments. Just a space for people to be treated with dignity. Trent looked away, the weight of Elijah's words pressing against the defenses he'd built around himself. He didn't know how to respond, didn't know if there was a response. You think I did this to humiliate you, Elijah said, his voice gentler now. But that was never my intention. I did this to remind you, and everyone else, that how you treat people matters. It always matters. Trent glanced up, his throat tightening. There was something disarming about Elijah's calmness, his lack of anger or bitterness. It made Trent feel exposed, his own behavior laid bare in a way he couldn't ignore. What happens to me now? Trent asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Elijah's expression didn't change. That's up to you, he said simply. What you do next is your choice. You can keep doing things the way you always have, or you can decide to change. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Trent nodded slowly, his face pale as he processed the gravity of what Elijah was offering, not punishment, but a chance at redemption. Elijah turned back to Rachel, his tone lighter now. And you, he said, are you ready to take the next step? Rachel blinked, startled. Me? She asked. What do you mean? Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. He handed it to her with a small smile. Open it, he said. Rachel unfolded the envelope with trembling hands, her eyes widening as she read the letter inside. It was a formal job offer, a position at a non-profit organization Elijah supported, focused on community outreach and development. Alongside the offer was a personal note in elegant handwriting. For those ready to build a better future. E. Carter. Rachel stammered, her voice catching in her throat. You're offering me a job? Elijah nodded. I see potential in you, Rachel. You've already taken the first step tonight. Now, it's up to you to decide where you want to go. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes as she clutched the envelope to her chest. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Say yes, Elijah said simply, his smile warm and encouraging. Rachel laughed softly, wiping at her eyes. Yes, she said firmly. Yes, I'll do it. Elijah gave her a small nod, satisfaction gleaming in his eyes. Good. The world could use more people like you. The trucks began to pull away in the distance, their taillights disappearing into the night. Elijah turned back to the store one last time, his gaze lingering on the empty space. Every ending is a beginning, he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. Then, with a final nod to Rachel and a glance at the still silent Trent, he stepped out onto the sidewalk and disappeared into the cool, quiet night. Elijah stepped out into the cool night air, his breath visible in the damp chill left behind by the rain. The streetlights flickered faintly, casting long shadows onto the wet pavement. Behind him, the second truck roared to life, its headlights cutting through the fog as it began to pull away. Elijah stood still for a moment, watching it disappear down the street, his hands resting in his coat pockets. Rachel emerged a moment later, her footsteps quick and purposeful as she caught up to him. Mr. Carter, she called softly, her voice carrying a mix of urgency and admiration. Wait. Elijah turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. Yes? He asked, his tone as calm as ever. She hesitated, suddenly unsure of what she wanted to say. Her hands fidgeted at her sides, her thoughts swirling. I wanted to thank you, she said finally. For everything, not just what you're doing for the people out there, but for what you've shown me. Elijah tilted his head slightly, his expression curious. And what's that? Rachel took a deep breath, her words tumbling out in a rush. That I don't have to stay silent when something feels wrong. That I can make a difference, even in small ways. Her cheeks flushed as she added, I think I've been too afraid to speak up for a long time. And seeing you do all of this, it's made me realize I don't want to stay afraid." Elijah's face softened, a warm smile spreading across his features. "Fear has a way of keeping us small," he said gently. "But once you step past it, you'll find there's a lot more you can do than you ever thought possible." Rachel nodded, her chest tightening with emotion. "I want to be better," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor beneath it. "I want to stand up for the right things like you." "You've already started," Elijah said. "Recognizing what needs to change is the first step. The rest is just following through." She smiled, her shoulders relaxing as his words sank in. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was moving toward something meaningful. The sound of footsteps drew their attention back toward the store. Trent had stepped outside, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his expression guarded. He stood a few feet away, shifting awkwardly as if he didn't know how to approach. Elijah gave him a steady look, waiting for him to speak. Trent hesitated, his gaze darting between Elijah and Rachel before finally settling on Elijah. "I don't get it," Trent said, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier bravado. "Why go this far? You've already made your point. Why buy the store? Why, any of it?" Elijah studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "What you see as going too far, I see as long overdue." Trent frowned, but Elijah continued before he could respond. "This isn't just about proving a point. It's about building something better. For years, stores like this have thrived on the idea that some people belong and others don't. I'm changing that. This store will be a place where everyone feels welcome. No more assumptions, no more judgments. Just a space for people to be treated with dignity." Trent looked away, the weight of Elijah's words pressing against the defenses he'd built around himself. He didn't know how to respond, didn't know if there was a response. "You think I did this to humiliate you," Elijah said, his voice gentler now. "But that was never my intention. I did this to remind you and everyone else that how you treat people matters. It always matters." Trent glanced up, his throat tightening. There was something disarming about Elijah's calmness, his lack of anger or bitterness. It made Trent feel exposed, his own behavior laid bare in a way he couldn't ignore. "What happens to me now?" Trent asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Elijah's expression didn't change. "That's up to you," he said simply. "What you do next is your choice. You can keep doing things the way you always have, or you can decide to change." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Trent nodded slowly, his face pale as he processed the gravity of what Elijah was offering. Not punishment, but a chance at redemption. Elijah turned back to Rachel, his tone lighter now. "And you," he said, "are you ready to take the next step?" Rachel blinked, startled. "Me?" she asked. "What do you mean?" Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. He handed it to her with a small smile. "Open it," he said. Rachel unfolded the envelope with trembling hands, her eyes widening as she read the letter inside. It was a formal job offer, a position at a non-profit organization Elijah supported, focused on community outreach and development. Alongside the offer was a personal note in elegant handwriting. "For those ready to build a better future. E. Carter." Rachel stammered, her voice catching in her throat. "You're offering me a job?" Elijah nodded. "I see potential in you, Rachel. You've already taken the first step tonight. Now it's up to you to decide where you want to go." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes as she clutched the envelope to her chest. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes," Elijah said simply, his smile warm and encouraging. Rachel laughed softly, wiping at her eyes. "Yes," she said firmly. "Yes, I'll do it." Elijah gave her a small nod, satisfaction gleaming in his eyes. "Good. The world could use more people like you." The trucks began to pull away in the distance, their taillights disappearing into the night. Elijah turned back to the store one last time, his gaze lingering on the empty space. "Every ending is a beginning," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. Then, with a final nod to Rachel and a glance at the still silent Trent, he stepped out onto the sidewalk and disappeared into the cool, quiet night. The hum of the trucks faded into the distance, leaving the street quiet again. Rachel stood by the doorway, still holding the envelope tightly to her chest, as if afraid it might vanish if she let it go. Behind her, Trent lingered near the counter, staring at the now empty store with a dazed expression. The pristine displays that had once showcased luxury goods were barren, leaving the boutique looking stark and lifeless. The walls seemed to echo with a silence that felt heavier than the tension lingering in the air. Rachel finally broke the quiet. "I still can't believe this happened," she said softly, her voice carrying a mix of awe and disbelief. She turned to Trent, her face flushed with emotion. "He just changed everything." Trent let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "Changed everything?" he repeated, his tone bitter. "All he did was walk in here, throw his money around, and make a mess of my store." Rachel frowned, her grip tightening on the envelope. "It's not your store anymore," she said, the words coming out sharper than she intended. She glanced down, hesitating, but the weight of the night gave her the courage to continue. "And it's not a mess. What he did, what he's doing, it's bigger than this place, you just don't want to see it." Trent turned toward her, his eyes narrowing. "What's that supposed to mean?" Rachel's voice steadied, her confidence growing as she spoke. "It means you've spent so much time looking down on people, on customers, on me, on him, that you can't see what's right in front of you. He didn't just buy out the store to prove you wrong. He did it to prove that this place can be something better." Trent's face hardened, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes. Guilt? Shame? He crossed his arms tightly, his body tense. "You think he's some kind of hero?" he snapped. "He just waltzes in here with his fancy card and acts like he owns the world." Rachel took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "No," she said firmly. "He didn't act like he owns the world. He acted like he belongs in it. And maybe that's what scared you." The words hit Trent like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For the first time all night he was at a loss, his usual confidence replaced by a deep, uncomfortable silence. Rachel watched him for a moment, then sighed and turned away, walking toward the door. She paused just before stepping outside, glancing back at him. "You can keep being angry, Trent," she said quietly. "Or you can try to be better. It's your choice." With that, she walked out into the night, her footsteps echoing softly on the wet pavement. She didn't look back. Inside the store, Trent stood alone, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He glanced around at the empty shelves, the barren walls, the quiet stillness that now filled the space he had once controlled. It felt different now, smaller, less certain. His eyes drifted toward the counter, where Elijah's presence still seemed to linger. He thought about the older man's calm confidence, the way he had spoken with quiet authority, as if he had nothing to prove to anyone. Trent hated how it made him feel, small, exposed, and unsure of himself. But beneath the anger and resentment there was something else, something he couldn't quite name. He sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. "What happens to me now?" he muttered, echoing the question he had asked Elijah earlier. The answer still hung in the air, unanswered. Trent's gaze shifted to the piece of paper Elijah had handed him earlier, the legal document outlining the sale of the store. It lay on the counter, crisp and clean, as if mocking him with its finality. For a moment he considered crumpling it up, throwing it away, pretending this night had never happened. But he didn't. Instead, he picked it up, staring at the bold signature at the bottom. Elijah Carter. The name seemed to carry more weight now than it had before. It wasn't just a signature, it was a reminder, a challenge, a call to action. Trent didn't know what he was supposed to do next, but as he stood there, alone in the empty store, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that maybe, Just maybe it wasn't too late to figure it out. Outside, Rachel walked slowly down the quiet street, her heart still racing from the events of the evening. The envelope in her hands felt heavier now, not just with the promise of a new job, but with the responsibility that came with it. Elijah's words echoed in her mind. Every small choice adds up. Every voice matters. She stopped under a street lamp, the light casting a warm glow over her. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was on the verge of something new, something bigger than herself. A faint smile tugged at her lips as she looked down at the envelope, then back toward the now dim boutique in the distance. Change had begun, and she was ready to be a part of it. Rachel walked further down the dimly lit street, the envelope clutched tightly in her hands. The night air was crisp now, fresh after the rain, and carried with it a feeling of renewal. She paused for a moment at the corner, glancing back at the boutique one last time. The lights inside had been dimmed, and Trent was no longer visible through the large windows. The place felt hollow, as though it were shedding its old identity and preparing for something entirely new. She smiled faintly, her mind replaying Elijah's words. Every small choice adds up. Every voice matters. For so long, she had silenced her own voice, convincing herself it wasn't worth the risk to speak up. But tonight had shown her what could happen when one person decided to take a stand, not just for themselves, but for something larger. Rachel turned away and began walking again, her thoughts moving ahead to the future. The nonprofit job Elijah had offered felt like a lifeline, a chance to step out of the shadows and finally contribute to something meaningful. The idea of working with a team, dedicated to uplifting others, filled her with a kind of hope she hadn't felt in years. She resolved, then and there, to make the most of the opportunity. Back at the boutique, Trent remained inside, pacing the empty aisles like a restless ghost. The legal document Elijah had handed him still sat on the counter, its edges curling slightly under the weight of his hesitation. He stared at it for a long time, the bold, unwavering signature standing out against the stark white page. Trent couldn't deny the unease that had settled deep in his chest, gnawing at him like a splinter he couldn't remove. The truth of the matter, the truth Elijah had quietly but powerfully exposed, was that Trent had spent years hiding behind his authority, his rules, and his carefully curated biases. He had told himself he was just doing his job, that the judgments he made were harmless, even necessary. But tonight, every excuse he'd used to justify his actions felt flimsy, like a house of cards collapsing under the weight of something undeniable. His pride told him to tear up the document, to push back and reclaim his control over the store. But a quieter, nagging voice inside him, the same voice that had made him hesitate when Elijah first stood his ground, whispered something different. Change is hard, but it's harder to stay the same once you know better. Trent exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples as the weight of his choices pressed down on him. He thought about Rachel's parting words, "You can try to be better, it's your choice," and hated how much they stung. But the sting wasn't from her judgment, it was from the truth he'd been unwilling to face. With a heavy sigh, he picked up the legal document and scanned the terms again. Elijah hadn't just bought the store, he had included stipulations for its future operations. The boutique would no longer cater exclusively to high-end clientele. Instead, it would operate as a community-focused business, offering affordable goods while providing job training and employment opportunities for underserved groups in the neighborhood. Trent's stomach churned as he read the words. He imagined himself running a store with that mission, interacting with the very people he had spent years dismissing or ignoring. The idea felt foreign, uncomfortable, even overwhelming. But beneath the discomfort was something else, a spark of curiosity. Could he actually be part of something like this? Could he undo the harm he had contributed to for so long? He set the paper down and leaned against the counter, his thoughts swirling. For the first time in years, Trent didn't have all the answers, but he realized, with a mixture of dread and relief, that maybe that was the point. Several blocks away, Elijah walked at an unhurried pace, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, The streets were quiet now, the faint sound of distant traffic blending with the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. He felt a calm satisfaction settle over him, the kind that came not from winning but from knowing he had done what needed to be done. He passed a small park and paused by a bench, taking a seat and gazing out at the open space. The air smelled fresh and clean, carrying the faint scent of rain-soaked earth. For a moment he closed his eyes, letting the stillness of the night wash over him. He thought of Clara, her voice, her smile, the way she had always seen the good in people, even when the world gave her every reason not to. She had been the one to teach him the importance of persistence, of standing tall in the face of adversity. Her memory was a constant presence in his life, a quiet reminder of the dreams they had shared and the battles they had fought together. "I hope you'd be proud," he murmured softly, his voice barely audible against the breeze. "We're getting there, Clara. Slowly, but surely." The sound of footsteps drew his attention, and he looked up to see a young boy walking with his mother along the edge of the park. The boy glanced over and stopped, tugging on his mother's hand. "Mom, is that him?" he asked excitedly, pointing at Elijah. "The man from the store?" The woman gave Elijah a small, knowing smile, then nodded. "It sure looks like it," she said. The boy ran up to Elijah, his face alight with curiosity and admiration. "Are you the man who bought all those things for people?" he asked, his voice bubbling with excitement. Elijah chuckled softly, nodding. "I am," he said. "And what's your name, young man?" "Marcus," the boy replied, his chest puffing up slightly as he spoke. "My mom said you're helping a lot of people." "I'm trying," Elijah said with a kind smile. "It takes more than one person to make a difference, though. It takes all of us." Marcus beamed, clearly inspired, and his mother stepped closer, offering Elijah a warm smile. "Thank you for what you did," she said sincerely. "It's not every day you see someone take a stand like that." Elijah nodded humbly. "Thank you," he said. "Sometimes it just takes the right moment." As the boy and his mother continued on their way, Elijah sat back on the bench, his heart full. Tonight wasn't the end of the journey. It was just the beginning. And as he gazed out at the quiet park, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The world was changing slowly but surely, and he was ready to keep pushing it forward, one small choice at a time. The next morning, the city was alive again, bustling with its usual rhythm. The rain from the night before had cleared, leaving behind the crisp, clean scent of renewal. For many it was just another day, but for those who lived in the community surrounding the boutique, the events of the previous night had already started to ripple outward. At a local community center just a few blocks away, the first of the trucks arrived. Workers and volunteers, who had received notice about a major donation only hours earlier, were already waiting. The large delivery doors creaked open to reveal boxes upon boxes of clothes, shoes, bags, and other items, all meticulously packed and labeled. A young woman in a worn jacket approached the first box, her face lighting up as she pulled out a brand new coat. She turned to one of the workers, her voice shaking slightly. "Is this really for us? For anyone who needs it?" The worker nodded with a smile. "Every bit of it. Take what you need." Word spread quickly throughout the neighborhood, and by mid-morning, families began arriving at the community center. People who had spent years scraping by were now able to pick up quality items for themselves and their loved ones, things they could never have afforded otherwise. Parents found sturdy shoes for their children. A young man picked out a blazer for job interviews. A grandmother ran her hands over a warm scarf, tears welling in her eyes as she thought about how it would protect her from the cold. Amid the buzz of activity, Elijah arrived quietly, dressed in his usual modest attire. He didn't announce himself or seek recognition. Instead, he stood near the back of the room watching as the goods were distributed. The sight of so many people benefiting from something as simple as a few boxes of clothes filled him with a deep, quiet satisfaction. Rachel spotted him almost immediately. She had arrived early to help coordinate the distribution, eager to take on the responsibility Elijah had placed in her hands. She approached him with a clipboard in hand, her face lit with a mix of pride and excitement. "Mr. Carter," she said warmly. I wasn't sure you'd come. Elijah smiled faintly. I wouldn't miss it, he said. This is the part that matters. Rachel nodded, glancing around at the bustling room. It's incredible, she said. I've never seen anything like this. People are walking out of here with more than just clothes. They're walking out with hope. That's the idea, Elijah said simply. He watched a mother helping her young daughter try on a pair of shoes, the little girl giggling as her mother knelt to adjust the laces. Sometimes hope starts small, a new pair of shoes, a warm coat, but it grows. And when it grows, it spreads. Rachel hesitated, then asked the question that had been lingering in her mind since the night before. Do you think Trent will ever understand what you were trying to do? Elijah's smile didn't waver. That's up to him, he said. People don't change because you force them to. They change because they decide to. All you can do is plant the seed and hope it takes root. Rachel considered his words, then nodded slowly. She could still see the tension in Trent's face from the night before, the way he had struggled to process what had happened. Part of her wanted to believe he would change, but another part of her wasn't sure he had it in him. I think you're right, she said finally, and I think you planted more than one seed last night. Elijah chuckled softly, his gaze still on the families filling the room. Let's hope so. Meanwhile, back at the boutique, Trent stood alone in the middle of the empty store. He had spent the entire morning walking through the now vacant space, replaying the events of the previous night over and over in his mind. The shelves were stripped bare, the displays dismantled, and the polished floors echoed with every step he took. The document Elijah had handed him still sat on the counter, its edges now creased from being handled so many times. Trent had read it at least a dozen times, trying to find a loophole, a way to cling to the control he had always prized. But every time he reached the end of the document, the truth was staring back at him. The store wasn't his anymore. It belonged to Elijah now, and the terms of the sale meant it would never go back to what it had been. For the first time in years, Trent felt a deep, gnawing uncertainty. He had built his career on exclusivity, on catering to a select group of people who could afford to buy their way into status and luxury. But Elijah had dismantled that with a single stroke, not by yelling or demanding, but by showing what was possible when the focus shifted from exclusion to inclusion. Trent leaned heavily against the counter, his hands gripping the edge. Rachel's words came back to him. You can try to be better. It's your choice. Could he really change? Could he unlearn years of ingrained habits and prejudices? The idea felt daunting, almost impossible. But another thought crept in, one he couldn't ignore. If Elijah could stand tall after everything he'd faced, what excuse did Trent have? With a deep breath, Trent picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Hi, Dad, Trent said, his voice unsteady. I think I've been doing things wrong, and I want to talk about it. Later that afternoon, Elijah sat at a quiet cafe near the community center, sipping a cup of tea and watching the world go by. The sky was bright now, the storm from the night before nothing more than a memory. The envelope containing his receipt for the store sat on the table beside him, a reminder of the work still ahead. As he gazed out the window, a young man approached cautiously, holding a notepad and pen. Excuse me, the man said nervously. Are you Elijah Carter? Elijah turned to him with a small smile. That's me. The young man shifted awkwardly. I'm a reporter, he said, holding up his notepad. Word about what you did last night is spreading, and I'd love to write a piece about it. If you don't mind, could I ask you a few questions? Elijah studied him for a moment, then gestured to the seat across from him. Go ahead, he said. The reporter sat down, his pen poised. What made you decide to buy out the store and turn it into something entirely different? Elijah thought for a moment, then replied, Because I've lived long enough to know that change doesn't come unless someone is willing to take the first step. I didn't do this for attention or recognition. I did it because there are people out there who've been waiting too long for someone to say, You belong here." The reporter scribbled furiously, nodding as Elijah continued. "Sometimes, all it takes is one act of kindness, one moment of standing up to remind people of their worth. That's what I wanted to do." The reporter smiled, his eyes shining with admiration. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," he said. "I think this story is going to inspire a lot of people." Elijah nodded humbly. "That's all I could ever hope for." As the reporter left, Elijah leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the sky. The world wasn't perfect, and there was still so much work to be done. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he'd helped push it in the right direction. And that, he thought, was more than enough. With a quiet smile, he finished his tea, got up from his seat, and stepped back into the bright, bustling streets, ready for whatever came next. Elijah Carter walked down the bustling street, the afternoon sun warming his face. The world around him buzzed with life, children laughing, neighbors chatting, the distant hum of traffic. It felt different now, not because the world itself had changed, but because of the quiet shift he had helped ignite. His actions had planted seeds of kindness, of hope, of belonging. The boutique wasn't just an empty store anymore. It was a symbol of what could happen when courage met compassion. Rachel had found her voice, Trent had taken his first steps toward redemption, and countless people in the community were reminded of their worth. Elijah didn't see himself as a hero, just a man fulfilling a promise to his late wife and to everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Change, he knew, didn't come all at once, but it started somewhere, and with every choice, every act, it grew stronger. As he turned a corner, Elijah smiled to himself. The world didn't need grand gestures to heal. It needed people willing to stand up, speak out, and lift others. That, he thought, was the greatest gift of all. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring tales and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your voice.